First recorded vote of the day. This Wednesday in the U.S. House of Representatives, members voting on the rule to lead to debate on h.j.res 90, the World Trade Organization agreement. The resolution reverses congressional approval for U.S. membership in the WTO. And if this rule is adopted, 2 hours of general debate would begin, and then a final vote. And then we'll go back to some more fiscal year 2001 spending bills a bit later. For now, some more background on this WTO legislation from reporter Steve Norton. We taped this interview with him yesterday.
Steve Norton of Congress Daily, there's going to be a resolution about the World Trade Organization. What's it about?
This is a resolution which basically would, the question is whether the U.S. will withdraw from the 135-member World Trade Organization. The reason why this vote has to occur is that the legislation that created the World Trade Organization and that began the participation of the U.S. in the WTO 5 years ago specifically called for a 5-year review. The President had to submit a report to Congress outlining the progress that the WTO is making and how the U.S. is faring in international trade with regard to market access and agricultural products and intellectual privacy, privacy and intellectual property issues, a whole range of issues, and most notably, of course, recently, the accession of China and Taiwan to the World Trade Organization. That report came out as scheduled in March, and as required, Congress can vote on maintaining membership in the WTO.
Who's the sponsor of the resolution?
I believe it's Congressman Ron Paul from Texas. Congressman Paul is a former libertarian candidate for the presidency some years ago. I would imagine his concerns about the WTO is that it sort of, the WTO has often been seen as a large organization without any accountability, that doesn't respect national sovereignty. And there are a lot of people who are concerned, of course, on the other end, that the World Trade Organization is making it easier and easier to disregard environmental laws and labor rights, all in the interest of freer trade, which they say benefits only the very few and the very rich.
How much support is there for this resolution?
There's very, very little support for the resolution. Most members of Congress will likely want to continue U.S. participation in the WTO. The resolution came out of the House Ways and Means Committee some weeks ago on a vote of 35-0, but it was a motion of unfavorable review. So in other words, it's the Ways and Means Committee is essentially sending this to the House floor saying we don't like it, 35-0. Now, that's not to say that there is blanket support for the WTO. As I was saying, there is concern that the U.S., that U.S. law becomes subordinate to an unelected international body, and there are concerns about the enforceability of labor and environmental concerns as well. When the Ways and Means Committee took up this resolution, there were concerns raised from the Republicans as well as the Democrats about the future of the organization. One of the chief things that has come up is the settlement of disputes. In the last couple years, the U.S. and the European Union have had disputes. Two major ones come to mind, one over bananas. The Europeans prefer to get their bananas from some of their former colonies. The U.S. is saying, no, you should buy bananas from the countries that we like doing business with. And the WTO ruled against the Europeans. Well, the Europeans have pretty much come up with one excuse after another and essentially ignored the ruling of the WTO. There was another situation involving the import of American beef. Now, the thing is, though, the U.S. Trade Representative, Charlene Barshevsky, testified Tuesday before the Senate Finance Committee that there have been a lot of disputes. And in 28 disputes that the U.S. has been involved with in the last year or so, they've won, the U.S. has won 25 of them. So, yes, there are problems with the enforceability of WTO rulings, and yes, there are disputes, but I think what the administration is trying to bring out is that the World Trade Organization is at least now an organization where countries can come together under a rule of law and actually resolve their differences of opinion. Certainly, there needs to be reforms because the idea that Europe can thumb its nose at a WTO ruling for year after year certainly erodes the credibility of the organization itself, and that's something that will have to be looked at in the years ahead.
Steve Norton works for Congress Daily.
Steve Norton joined us yesterday for a preview of this bill on the WTO. It's h.j.res 90, the actual bill there. The h.j.res 528 on the floor refers to the rule, which is what the House is voting on right now. 2 hours of general debate would follow, and then, of course, a final vote.
For what purpose the gentleman from Illinois rise?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to h.res 528, I call up h.res 90 and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title of the joint resolution.
House Joint Resolution 90, joint resolution withdrawing the approval of the United States from the agreement establishing the World Trade Organization.
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on h.res 90.
Without objection. Pursuant to House Resolution 528, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Crane, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Paul, and the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman spin. Gentleman may continue.
And I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to h.j.res 90, a resolution to withdraw congressional approval of the agreement establishing the World Trade Organization. The Committee on Ways and Means reported this resolution with an adverse recommendation by a vote of 35 to nothing. Put simply, the consensus in the committee was that it would be unthinkable and illogical for the United States to withdraw from the WTO. The WTO stands apart from many other international institutions in that it functions on a day-to-day basis almost completely in favor of American interests. In setting international rules for trade, the United States has had to make relatively few concessions in exchange for having open access to consumers in 136 other countries. The WTO system is fundamentally American-based rules of the road for commerce that limit discriminatory trade barriers and damaging sanctions. Because of the strength of U.S. leadership since World War II, our trading partners have been willing to accept this structure of fair trade rules and principles. Congress has been heavily involved in the development of these rules and principles since the establishment of the GATT in 1947. At the same time, the WTO cannot prevent the United States from establishing whatever level of food safety or environmental protection on imports that we see fit to impose. The WTO system of fair play only requires that we apply the same standards to both foreign and domestic producers. Since its inception in 1995, the WTO has functioned effectively, aiding our efforts to increase job-creating U.S. exports. The best engine for our impressive economic growth has been expanding international trade under the oversight of the WTO. Since 1995, exports have risen by $235 billion. When we increase exports, in particular, we are increasing the number of high-wage, high-tech jobs in cities and towns across America. There is absolutely no better strategy for improving living standards than to pry away trade barriers and grow foreign products for grow foreign markets, rather, for U.S. products. Nearly 12 million high-wage American jobs depend directly on our ability to export under predictable rules. Rules without a mechanism for enforcement would not mean much. The WTO dispute settlement system succeeds in encouraging the resolution of hundreds of trade conflicts through amicable consultations. In the 27 cases where the U.S. filed a formal challenge to foreign practices, we prevailed in 25. Our victories have won millions of dollars in increased sales for U.S. firms and workers. In establishing the WTO dispute settlement system, Congress insisted on a mechanism with moral authority, but with no power to compel a change in our laws or regulations. Any decision to comply with a WTO panel is solely an internal decision of the United States. In the difficult WTO case against U.S. foreign sales corporations that we are struggling with now, neither the European Union nor the WTO can impose any course of action on the United States. As the world's leading exporter, the United States benefits enormously from the common-sense ground rules of the WTO, such as national treatment, non-discrimination, and due process. This is not a perfect organization by any stretch, but to pull out now would mean reverting to a dark time 60 years ago when international trade was governed by political whim and a dangerous absence of rules and fair practices, and I urge no on the vote on h.j.res 90 and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of time.